strategic excellence is on the strategic plan, we will now be accountable to diversity, inclusion, and social justice strategically. And just one more thing, part of it becomes, for us, a little bit of embarrassment to the leadership. The executive team, which at my school is still all white, less one person, it becomes an embarrassment when the student body is not majority white and the leadership is, and you have this college now in a movement model that's waking up to this, and they're now looking at the executive team going, what is that? The president then becomes embarrassed publicly because what are we doing? And I think that's a positive thing. But so I think bottom and top.
Right. Well, they're not contradictory things. I think you can have a movement model that puts enough pressure on the leadership at the top that they have very little choice but to respond. And I think those are where those two things connect. What I would say that's really important, though, right, is that part of this conversation with the top, right, and this is both the pressure that comes from the bottom and just in our everyday conversations, is the way this relates back to white nationalism and white identity politics on campus is if the only way that an institution is going to get ahead of that curve, because we can respond to stuff, right? We can respond to a hate incident, we can respond to yet another blackface party at Halloween, we can respond to yet some other absurd, thing that happens on Yik Yak, or we can say, listen, we want to get ahead of this. This is distracting to our mission, this is distracting and undermining who we are as a community. And if institutions would go all in saying, this is our mission, this is what we mean by it, then it becomes possible to actually respond to that by saying, okay, you violated the agreement, like you basically signed a contract when you agreed to come here that you're part of this institution, you're part of this mission, you're about furthering that. You can have conservative views. It's not that everybody's got to have the same politics. And there are plenty of people who would consider themselves relatively conservative who could still endorse these core values. They might have a very different way of getting there than I would want to, and that's fine, and we can have that discussion. But if you're going to actually engage in white nationalism and white backlash politics rooted in really hateful and the kind of rhetoric that, again, it isn't about white folks just wanting a place at the table. That's the opportunity model. We just want a place at that table. It's about white folks saying, this is our table, and we're taking it and going to the other room, and y'all can't be at the table at all. It's very different. Schools are under no obligation to indulge that, especially when they have this set of values. So I think if schools would have that conversation about operationalizing their mission, it doesn't inoculate entirely, because there are always going to be people that are going to, push that envelope and try to get away with stuff. But it does allow the school to say, hey, we warned y'all. We told you what the norms were. We're not just coming at you with this after the fact and you didn't know. You knew when you came. Like you knew when you read the catalog or got on the website, this was right there, that this is what we're about. And as a result, we can ask you to maybe move on without you feeling like you're some kind of victim, because we told you up front what this was going to be. It's like if you go into the church, any church, and you stand up in the third row of pews, and you're like, yelling at the preacher, at some point they might just say, you're sort of violating our norms, you've got to go. And if you did any of that stuff that's happening on campus and the workplace, you would be fired. So I don't know why universities are under any obligation to indulge a madness that no other, in the name of what? In the name of intellectual exchange? What is the intellectual exchange with a blackface incident? Like, what is your point there? Exactly. Like, what is your argument there? Even the chalking, like you chalked and then you went back to your res hall. Like, I can't even have a conversation with the sidewalk. So what the hell is your argument? Like, there's no argument there. You can't even have, so it's not intellectual discourse. So I feel we've got to do this, A, because it's the right thing, but also because from a leadership and administrative perspective, it's also more functional to try to do this as a way to inoculate yourself against a lot of the silliness and madness that's been happening. Yes, in the back.
Another way to create those spaces to have that conversation is to have a common reading. And an example would be in Nashville, at Vanderbilt, requiring all the freshmen to read Stride Inside, which tells the tale of the first African-American basketball player full scholarship in the SEC. Yeah. And this story is not very favorable to Vanderbilt at all.
Right.
This provides an opportunity for the city and the college to reflect and perhaps think about some reconciliation regarding those issues.
Right, well that's a good example of, and that story is a very important story, and what's interesting about it, unlike most summer reads or most college reads, first year reads or whatever they are, that one actually is about that institution. It's one thing to have a read where we read some bestseller that everyone's reading and then we reflect on it, and that's fine. But to have you actually have to read something about the history of your own school is a much different thing. Or to do what happened at Brown, several years ago, when it was sort of, there was this big discussion about we're going to actually examine, when Ruth Simmons went to Brown, right? We're going to examine the history of our institution and its relationship to enslavement. Like, that was a serious sort of truth and reconciliation, which term I don't like a lot. Like, the reconciliation piece is like a weird term because it implies that there was conciliation ever, and then we need to redo that when really there wasn't. But you know what I mean? But it's a truth and reconciliation process of being brutally honest about one's own past as we begin to move forward. Again, going back to what I led off with, right? Which I told you this would somehow come full circle, and somehow I made that happen. But the idea that if you understand your past, like, what we're doing now isn't weird. It isn't unfair favoritism for certain people. It's being accountable. It's being responsible for the institution that we've inherited and for its legacy, whether that's Mizzou's legacy, whether that's Brown's legacy, whether it's Vanderbilt's legacy. And those schools that are willing to have that conversation end up being far better places for people and far more able to engage in an equitable sort of institutional creation. In the moment that we have left, because I know we're going to run out of time, I do want to say this. And I want to say it because I think as a matter of accountability for me and for other practitioners, we need to also be honest about some of the way that we have done the work wrong. And here's what I mean by that. When we talk about privilege, and I'm going to leave you with this thought as you go out, and I just want us to, and I'm going to say this as an educator, not as an activist, because as an educator, my concern is what works. My concern is not what makes me feel righteous, right? Because I feel righteous when I bust it off on somebody on social media, but that does not work. It makes me feel good for about a minute, and then I'm like, we all do that. We all make mistakes. But here's the thing. When we talk about privilege on our campuses, whether it's a training, in the res halls, in the classroom, I think for many of us, and I can't speak for everyone, but I know that for me and a lot of folks, we have long not been willing to engage the nuance and complexity of privilege, right? And so what we've done, for instance, is, I remember many years ago, I would do these trainings, I would talk about white privilege, and there would always be the white person in the room who would try, in my estimation, to deflect the conversation. We've all been there, right, where they all of a sudden, so it's a white woman brings up sexism and misogyny, it's an LGBT white person brings up straight supremacy or heteronormativity and transphobia, or it's a working class white person, because when white privilege comes up, all white people are from Appalachia all of a sudden. All of a sudden, we're all the third generation grandchildren of hardworking miners in Eastern Kentucky. And some of us are, many are not, but here's the thing. I used to be of the opinion that when somebody did that, it was an obligation to steer the conversation immediately back to white privilege and almost not scold them for the deflection, but sort of, make it real obvious. I saw what you did and stop doing that, and we're going to get back to the real point. What I learned as an educator over the years was not only was that not very effective, it's sort of an asshole move. Because even though it might be a deflection, the reality is misogyny is some real shit. Right? And rape culture is real, and classism is real, and straight supremacy is real, and all of those systems of oppression are real, and they intersect, and they interact, and they contribute to one another. So I learned over time, like, you know what, we can have a conversation and reduce some of that defensiveness that we see. I'm going to let you have that victory, is essentially what I came to, right? This idea, like, you need to talk about your class injury, I'm going to give you that, because that's real. And not only is it real, but here's the thing. When you tell me about your class injury, I'm able to look at you and say, that's horrible and absolutely true. And I've experienced some of that myself. And what drives me nuts, having grown up without money, was when people with money would tell me that classism wasn't real, right? That used to drive me, that used to burn me, right? Like the idea that the class system isn't a real thing, and I knew because I lived it. So here's some white person telling me, well, what about my, impoverishment? What about the struggle? Yes, exactly. And what about when rich people tell you to get over it and ignore it? In other words, there's a way to use that deflection, even if it's that, as a way to actually talk about privilege. And with me, I stopped talking mostly about privilege as material stuff, even though there's a material component. I primarily talk about it as a psychological state of obliviousness, this ability to be oblivious to other people's truth and other people's history and other people's reality. And that's something we all experience. Every single one of us. So I think maybe if we begin to have this conversation where we say, listen, this isn't just about straight, white, Christian, cisgendered males having privilege. Everyone in a college environment has got some identity where they are dominant. Just because you're in a college in this country makes you have certain privilege relative to 99.99% of the world. And if we're willing to admit that, that doesn't take away from the injury of white supremacy or of patriarchy and misogyny or of capitalism and the class system or of straight supremacy. It just says things are complicated. And if we're willing to deal with them in a complicated way, if we're willing to say, able-bodied folks have privilege, even if they're folks of color facing white supremacy. What do able-bodied people not think about? All the stuff that folks with disabilities think about, right? Autism allows those of us who are hearing to not have to think about what folks in the deaf community are thinking about, or to worry about whether we're going to have someone standing next to the speaker or the professor and actually signing for someone who's deaf. I don't have to think about that as a hearing person. That allows me to be oblivious, right? That's privilege. And so if we're willing to talk about it in this multi-layered, nuanced way, it becomes a lot harder for that white identity politics to take root, because that white identity politics, rooted in grievance, is based on the idea that, why are you picking on me, right? We're not. We're actually saying we all have, as my friend Jackie Wade, who was a social work professor for many years in the Nashville area, and I've worked with her many times, black woman who says, we all have a couple nickels in the quarter. And we all have to own our nickels. Some of us got a couple dimes in the quarter, just so we know, right? Because some of us have got multiple layers of privilege. But we all have a couple of nickels. And if I'm willing to own my nickels, maybe you'll own yours. It's like I grew up Jewish in Nashville, so, there's that. And there were plenty of times that I knew what that meant, because I would have teachers stick their head in the room and just remind me, you're going to hell, right? As if I'd forgotten since Tuesday, the last one. Right? There's like a lake of fire, and you got all your ancestors are there preparing a place for you in it. Yes, thank you. You told me. I could have stayed in that place, right, where I got hurt, because that was real visceral. That was raw. Like I know what that was. But if I want solidarity for me, right, around my injury, I got to own the other stuff. The fact that I had advantages my black students and friends that I would play ball with didn't have. I had to own the white piece if I wanted solidarity for the Jewish piece, right? I had to own that. And if we just all are willing to have that conversation, then it's harder for somebody to go, why are you picking on me? Because we're picking on everybody. We're basically saying, what is the thing you take for granted, personally and institutionally? What is the stuff that you take for granted? Institutions take those qualification standards for granted. They don't interrogate them. We as individuals take our own experience and history for granted. We don't interrogate that. Part of this is about interrogating all the stuff that we've been taking for granted for so long and encouraging people to recognize that we're all part of that equation. At the end of the day, there's this saying that a friend of mine who does this work with young people and folks in independent schools says, the key here is being hard on systems and soft on people, right? Hard on systems and soft on people. Right? That's not to say that people don't piss you off, and it's easy to fire back at people because it's people that tweet at you, right? Not institutions. It's people that post crazy stuff on Facebook. It's people that do yik yak. It's not the building doing it, right? But if we're going to understand people's damage, including their backlash, including their anxiety, including their neurosis about losing power or something, right? We're going to have to at least have enough compassion to recognize it's the system that set them up, right, to be in that place. And it's hard to be compassionate to folks who are engaged in such a horrible politic, but the fact is, if the system has created that, if the system has nurtured that mentality of entitlement, that mentality of expectation that leads to that, right, we have to be harder on the system than the individual, because the individual is doing exactly what they were programmed to do. If you're standing at the edge of a conveyor belt in a sausage factory and you don't know why it keeps giving you sausage, and you're standing there like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? I need some chicken nuggets. Well, the damn factory wasn't built to do chicken nuggets, and that conveyor belt's made to do sausage. So if you want chicken nuggets or whatever it is you want, vegan patties or whatever you're into, right, you're going to have to retool the machine. You're not going to be able to just yell at the chicken or the sausage or the people that work the machine. It's like, hey man, I just pushed the button. The machine did all that, right? We have to be harder on systems than we are on each other. And I think if we do that, we inoculate our spaces a little bit to some of that backlash politics. We move forward together and we're able to create more equitable institutions. I appreciate y'all being with me this morning.